She did not cry. That was the first thing I noticed, and the thing I have never been able to forget. The church was full of rustling silk, of whispered outrage, of Lady Celestine Vane laughing behind her gloved hand at the very back of the nave. And at the altar, in a gown the color of new cream, Miss Emmeline Holt stood with her hands folded and her chin perfectly level, as though the note that had just been pressed into the vicar's trembling hand contained nothing more consequential than a change in the hymn order. It did not. The vicar read it twice. He cleared his throat and looked at her with the expression of a man who wishes he had chosen any other vocation. "Miss Holt," he said, barely above a whisper, "it appears that Mr. Whitmore has. That is to say, there will be no—" "I understand," she said, quietly, clearly, so that the front 4 rows heard every syllable. I was in the last pew on the left, where I had seated myself 20 minutes earlier because I had received a letter. Anonymous, but not hard to trace. That told me precisely what Whitmore intended to do this morning. He had spent 3 weeks at Duncastle with the Holt family, wooing their elder daughter in full sight of society. Then, 9 days ago, the younger daughter, the brilliant, beautiful, and very rich Miss Celestine, had made him an offer he found considerably more attractive. He had written to Emmeline the night before the wedding. He had not even come to say it to her face. I had met Emmeline Holt once at Duncastle in the spring. She had been repairing a torn atlas page in the library when I blundered through looking for her father. She did not fuss or curtsy or play the grateful girl at the prospect of a duke in the doorway. She held up one finger, and finished the careful strip of parchment she was pressing into place before she looked up. "The atlas loses a coastline if I stop," she said, by way of explanation. Then she told me where to find her father. I had thought of her every day since. I stood up. The sound of the pew creaking brought her head around. Every head in the church turned with it, but I was not looking at any of them. I was looking only at her, at the steadiness in her gray eyes, at the way she had not crumbled, at the faint strain at the corners of her mouth that told me exactly what composure was costing her. The whispers began at once. I heard my name pass through the nave in ripples. Hartwell, the Duke of Hartwell, the Stormcold Duke, half awe, half alarm. The Stormcold, an epithet I had inherited along with the estate and the debts, earned in my first year in Parliament when I had delivered a speech so cutting that 3 ministers had left the chamber. I wore it without objection. I had never had cause to soften it, until now. I walked the length of that aisle slowly, because I wanted everyone to see. I wanted it recorded, retold, carried into every drawing room in the county, and all the way to London, what was about to happen. I stopped 2 feet from Emmeline Holt, and I turned to face her. "Miss Holt," I said. I kept my voice low, meant for her first and the assembled congregation second. "I realize this is not a conventional moment. I realize further that you have no reason to look favorably on any man who approaches you in a church today." I felt the tremor that went through her, barely visible, quickly suppressed. "But I have wished to speak to you since the spring, and I am not a man who manages patience well. If you would be willing to hear me, I would consider it the greatest honor of my life." She studied me. It was not a quick glance. It was the same careful attention she had given that atlas page, unhurried, thorough, as though she was pressing the edges down and deciding whether they would hold. "The Duke of Hartwell," she said, "does not, as a rule, appear in the last pew of village churches." "He does not," I agreed. He made an exception. Something shifted in her face. Not a smile, not yet, but the possibility of one held back with great effort. "You received intelligence about this morning." "I did. And you came anyway. You sat in the back and waited." "I did." It was a fair question. I had asked myself the same thing a dozen times on the road north. I had no clean answer. Only the memory of one finger held up while she finished mending a coastline, and the months of silence afterward, in which I had talked myself out of every letter I had started. I had told myself it was inappropriate. I had told myself I was imagining it. I had told myself a great many useful lies, because, I said, "You are the most honest person I have met in 38 years, and I have not been able to think of anything else." The church had gone entirely still. I was dimly aware of Lady Celestine, 6 rows back, no longer laughing. I was dimly aware of the vicar gripping the pulpit. None of it mattered. Emmeline Holt looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, with great precision, "You are aware that I have just been profoundly humiliated." "I am, and that anyone else in your position would find a reason to be elsewhere today." "I am aware of that as well." "Then you are either very brave," she said, "or very strange. Most who know me would say the latter." She made a sound that was very nearly a laugh. Then she reached out and placed her hand, light as a pressed flower, deliberate as a signature, on my offered arm. "I would like," she said, "to leave this church." We walked out together. I felt the collective intake of breath at our backs, the hush of 200 people watching the thing they would talk about for the next decade. The doors opened ahead of us, and the morning light came in clean and sharp after the stone dark of the nave. On the steps, she stopped. Her hand was still on my arm, and I could feel the smallest tremor in it now. Not weakness, but the loosening of something held very tightly for too long. "I am not going to weep," she said, as though informing me of a policy. "I did not expect you to." "I am, however," she said, "going to need a great deal of tea and at least 2 hours before I am ready to hear anything further. I had a carriage waiting. I had, in fact, brought Mrs. Allard, my housekeeper, specifically so that Emmeline would not be conveyed anywhere unaccompanied that would give society yet another thing to say. I had thought of it on the road. I had thought of rather a lot of things. The weeks that followed were nothing like a courtship novel. She stayed with her aunt in Fenwick, and I called every third day, exactly as often as was proper and not a single time more, because she had told me at the outset that she had no intention of being swept into anything before she had found her footing again, and I respected that absolutely. We talked. She asked me on the second visit what I had been like as a boy, and I found myself telling her the truth rather than the practiced version I usually offered. We argued, once, about the comparative merits of 2 competing theories of cartographic projection, and she won, and I told her so, and something in her shoulders softened permanently after that. I asked her to marry me in the library, not at Hartwell, at her aunt's house, in a room full of middling volumes and one very good atlas, which I had noticed on my second visit and admired deliberately. She was standing at the window when I spoke. She did not turn around immediately. "You are not asking me because you feel you must repair what Whitmore did," she said. "It was not a question. I am asking you," I said, "because that morning in the church I realized I had wasted 6 months being cautious, and I do not intend to waste another day." She turned then. Her expression was the one I had come to know best, that careful steadiness, and behind it, the warmth she did not distribute cheaply. "The Stormcold Duke," she said, "proposes in a borrowed library. He does. He is as established strange." She laughed, a real one, unguarded, the first I had heard at full volume. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." We married in the spring at Hartwell's chapel, with 30 guests and no fanfare. Emmeline wore deep blue, not white, and said afterward that she had chosen it specifically because it suited her, and for no other reason, which was entirely characteristic. Mr. Whitmore attended the county assembly that autumn with his new wife, Miss Celestine, on his arm. I am told they entered the room with considerable confidence and departed it rather quickly. Once it became apparent that the assembly's reigning topic of conversation was the Duke and Duchess of Hartwell and the remarkable morning in the village church at Duncastle. I did not attend that assembly. I was at home. Emmeline was in the library, repairing a watercolor map of the northern coast that had come loose from its backing, and I was reading in the chair beside her because I found, without any surprise by that point, that I could not manage to be in a different room. She finished the map. She looked up and found me watching her. She did not look away. "Coastline preserved?" I asked. "Entirely," she said. She set down the brush, crossed the room, and sat beside me. I put my arm around her, carefully, as I did everything that mattered, and we stayed there while the light changed on the walls of the room that was now, beyond all reason and every expectation, home. That is all there is to tell. The rest is hers and mine and no one else's business at all.